He thought it would be just another conviction, just another black teenager to dismiss before lunch. Judge Franklin Devereaux looked at 16-year-old Isaiah Mercer and saw nothing but trouble, nothing but another name on the docket. But when they picked Isaiah, they didn't know who they were messing with. They didn't know he had spent years studying case law instead of video games. They didn't know his mother was a paralegal who raised him to see through every courtroom trick in the book. What came next wasn't just justice. It was a reckoning that shook the system from the inside. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you're watching from, and make sure to subscribe because the story you're about to hear isn't just about one man. It's about all of us. Sunlight filtered through the courtroom blinds, casting long shadows across the silent benches. The laughter had died down. The judge's pen had stopped moving, and in the space between assumption and truth, a young man stood, steady, alone, and unshakably prepared to put the entire courtroom on trial. The moment 16-year-old Isaiah Mercer stepped into courtroom 6B, every eye in the gallery seemed to say the same thing. This kid doesn't stand a chance. The air was thick with unspoken assumptions. His age, his skin, his silence, all painted him as guilty before a word was spoken. Judge Franklin Devereaux didn't even try to hide his disdain. Leaning back in his oversized leather chair, he eyed Isaiah like he was late to a meeting that didn't concern him. The case was State vs. Mercer, and the charge? Grand theft auto with resistance, serious, heavy. But what weighed heavier was the casual arrogance laced through the courtroom. The bailiff smirked as he shuffled papers. The stenographer barely looked up, and the assistant DD leaned back in his seat like the verdict was already signed. None of them saw a young man with a future. They saw a statistic. Isaiah, dressed in a borrowed blazer and two big shoes, stood beside a trembling public defender who hadn't even bothered to learn how to pronounce his name. But Isaiah wasn't scared. Not really. There was something steady in his gaze, something that refused to shrink beneath the fluorescent lights or the judge's half-suppressed sneer. Judge Devereaux's voice cracked through the room, sharp and dry. "Mr. Mercer, let's keep this brief. I have a luncheon in 40 minutes. That drew a few soft chuckles from the audience. Even humor here had a hierarchy. Isaiah glanced around slowly. He heard the laughter, but he didn't flinch. Instead, he straightened his shoulders just slightly. Because deep down, he knew something none of them did. He knew this wasn't just about a car. It was about assumptions. Who gets heard, who gets believed, who gets dismissed, before they ever speak. And right then, standing in a courtroom built more for convictions than for truth, Isaiah made a quiet decision. He wouldn't go down easy. How many times have we looked at someone and assumed their story without hearing a word? And if you were in that room, would you have chuckled too? Or wondered why the judge thought justice should fit between lunch reservations? The courtroom had barely settled when Isaiah did something no one expected. He placed a calm hand on the trembling arm of his public defender and gently whispered something that froze her mid-sentence. Then, with the slow, deliberate confidence of someone who'd already rehearsed this moment in his mind 1,000 times, he stepped forward and said, "Your Honor, I will be representing myself." A hush fell like a sheet of glass cracking midair. Judge Devereaux blinked, eyebrows arched, lips already curling into a smirk. "You'll what?" he asked, voice tinged with sarcasm, loud enough to invite another round of restrained laughter from the gallery, but Isaiah didn't flinch. His voice, while soft, carried with surprising clarity. "I'll be defending myself, sir." There was something in his tone, measured, precise, unshaken, that momentarily broke the rhythm of courtroom theatrics. The assistant DD gave a mocking chuckle, leaned toward a colleague, and muttered, "This'll be over in 10 minutes. But Isaiah was unmoved. He wasn't here for their amusement. He had studied this world. Every motion, every objection, every slight delay designed to break people like him. And he knew that in this moment, he had to be more than prepared. He had to be undeniable. He took one step forward, then another, letting the silence stretch until even the judge's pen stopped moving. "Before we continue," Isaiah said evenly, "I'd like to confirm a few facts with the prosecution." A ripple of confusion passed through the room. It wasn't just what he said, it was how he said it. Clear, crisp, like a seasoned litigator. And for the first time, the smirk on the judge's face faltered. Just slightly. It was as if they had all prepared for a show, but no one had expected a challenge. Isn't it strange how quickly we laugh when we think we've already won? And yet, how often do we pause to ask, what if the person we're mocking is about to rewrite everything we think we know? Isaiah didn't rush. He stood still, eyes focused, hands clasped in front of him, not in fear, but in calculated control. The assistant DD, Mr. Cole Lancaster, cleared his throat and began outlining the state's case with the swagger of a man who delivered the same speech too many times to count. "Your Honor, the defendant was found with fingerprints on a stolen 2021 Lexus," he announced, pacing slowly before the jury. After leading officers on a brief pursuit through downtown, his words were clean, practiced, sharp as polished glass. Isaiah listened, unmoved. "We have surveillance footage showing the vehicle minutes before the arrest," Lancaster continued, "and Officer Marino's report clearly states he witnessed the defendant exiting the vehicle." Judge Devereaux nodded along, tapping his pen, bored, but already convinced. A few jurors leaned forward. Lancaster's voice carried the full weight of confidence, a tone that made guilt feel like a technicality. But Isaiah had been studying courtroom strategy since he was a child. Late nights at the kitchen table, watching his mother sift through depositions and discovery files. He'd seen the shortcuts. He knew how quickly a narrative could form when no one asked the right questions. And so he waited, letting the case build itself like a house of cards. He noticed every detail, the prosecutor's refusal to look him in the eye, the judge's impatience, the way the jurors seemed to absorb every word as fact. But beneath it all, Isaiah saw the cracks forming. Because he wasn't just listening, he was calculating. When Lancaster held up a printed police report as his final blow, Isaiah tilted his head slightly. He'd read that report too. He knew what wasn't in it. And that, he thought, would be the beginning of their unraveling. But first, he let the silence sit. Let them believe they had won. Let them settle into comfort. Because isn't that when truth hits the hardest? When no one sees it coming? Tell me, have you ever watched someone build their case on lies and smiled quietly, knowing the truth is already in your pocket? When the judge finally turned and asked the defense to respond, Isaiah stepped forward with the quiet authority of someone not asking for permission but taking his rightful place. His blazer still hung awkwardly on his shoulders, but now it didn't seem too big. It felt earned. He looked directly at the prosecutor. "Mr. Lancaster," he began calmly, "you stated Officer Marino witnessed me exiting the vehicle, is that correct?" Lancaster gave a lazy nod, as if the question was beneath him. "It's in the report." Isaiah nodded slowly. "And that report," he continued, turning to face the judge, "was used as the basis for my arrest and for the charges brought against me today?" "Correct," the judge replied, clearly growing impatient. "Then I move to dismiss that testimony as inadmissible," Isaiah said, letting the words land slowly, deliberately. The judge blinked. "On what grounds?" Isaiah reached into his folder, not a briefcase, just a simple file, and held up a printed GPS log request. "Because Officer Marino wasn't even on duty when the pursuit began. His report states he witnessed the chase firsthand, but his GPS log places him 2 miles away at a gas station until 10 minutes after the vehicle was abandoned." A sharp intake of breath broke through the gallery. Lancaster's posture stiffened. He opened his folder, flipping pages, his composure slipping like steam off a boiling pot. "This is highly irregular," he muttered. But it was too late. The jury had seen the crack. The judge looked from Isaiah to Lancaster, then back again. And in that long pause, you could feel the courtroom shifting. The smirks were gone, the laughter had dried up. "Your Honor," Isaiah added, "if Officer Moreno's timeline doesn't align with his own report, how can any of his statements be trusted?" Silence. Deep and cutting. Have you ever watched certainty collapse in real time? Watched a room full of doubters start to ask themselves, what else did we miss? Isaiah let the silence stretch just long enough for discomfort to settle in every corner of the courtroom. Then, with careful precision, he reached for a new document, one the prosecution had conveniently ignored. "Your Honor," he said, voice even and steady, "I'd like to submit into evidence the original police transcript from the vehicle's owner, Mr. Bernard Whitaker." Lancaster froze. For a moment it seemed he might interrupt, but he didn't, because he knew what was coming. Isaiah held up the page. The night his car was reported stolen, Mr. Whitaker told responding officers, and I quote, "I left it running while I ran into the store. Some white kid jumped in and drove off." A wave of stunned whispers rippled through the gallery like wind through dry leaves. Isaiah waited, then added, "I don't match the description. Not even close." He turned slowly to the jury, his gaze clear, his tone deliberate. "And yet, here I am." Judge Devereaux rubbed his temple, eyes narrowed, clearly searching for something to hold on to, but the ground was crumbling beneath him. Lancaster stammered, "That statement wasn't part of the evidence packet." "Exactly," Isaiah interrupted, still calm, "because if it had been, there would be no case, but it was in the initial police report. Someone chose to leave it out." The room was still now, uncomfortably still. "Your Honor," Isaiah said, turning back to the bench, "this case isn't about theft. It's about assumptions. A stolen car, a black teenager nearby, that was enough." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The facts were louder than outrage. The truth was echoing off the walls, and in that moment, even the judge's gavel seemed too heavy to lift. "So let me ask you, what do you call it when the truth is buried, not by accident, but by design? And what happens when the person they tried to silence is the one who knows exactly where to dig?" Judge Devereaux leaned back, exhaled slowly, and stared at Isaiah with an expression caught somewhere between disbelief and dawning recognition. He looked toward the jury, then back to Lancaster, whose confidence had now fully unraveled. Papers shuffled, collar tugged, voice gone. "Does the prosecution have anything further?" the judge asked, his voice noticeably less sure than before. Lancaster hesitated, opened his mouth, then closed it again. "No, Your Honor." The words barely came out. Devereaux turned to Isaiah, studied him in silence, then finally spoke. "Case dismissed." The words fell like a stone into a still pond. For a second, the room didn't move. And then, chaos. Reporters burst into motion, pens scratching, voices rising. The gallery stirred. Some gasped, some clapped, some just sat frozen. But Isaiah? He didn't move. He stood perfectly still, as if letting the weight of the moment settle on its own. Only when the noise around him began to recede did he turn and walk toward the courtroom doors, each step quiet, grounded, unhurried. Just before he reached them, Judge Devereaux called out, "Mr. Mercer." Isaiah paused, his hand on the doorframe, but didn't turn. The judge's voice was lower now, less arrogant, more human. "You should consider law school." Isaiah allowed himself the smallest smile. He didn't need to consider it. He had been preparing for this path his entire life. Outside, the sun had already begun to shift, casting long shadows down the courthouse steps. Reporters swarmed, shouting questions, cameras flashing like sirens. But Isaiah walked right through them, his hoodie pulled over his head, focused on the only person that mattered, his mother. She stood waiting at the bottom of the steps, arms crossed, face unreadable. For a long moment she just stared, then finally she exhaled. "Boy, you scared me half to death." Isaiah chuckled and scratched his head. Had to take a risk, Ma. She didn't reply, just pulled him into a long, wordless hug. And in that embrace, the courtroom disappeared. Because have you ever watched someone you raised stand tall in a world that tried to bury him? What does it feel like to see your child become his own defense against a system built to silence him? Across the street, partially hidden behind the glare of windshields and courthouse pillars, Judge Devereaux remained standing beside his car, watching Isaiah and his mother with a gaze no longer laced with mockery, but something closer to reflection. Perhaps even shame. The arrogance he'd worn like a second robe was gone now, replaced by a heavy stillness in his posture. He had entered that courtroom expecting another routine conviction, another number to push across his docket before lunch. But now, the echo of Isaiah's voice lingered longer than any gavel strike. Because Isaiah hadn't just defended himself, he'd exposed a system, layer by layer, assumption by assumption, and as he walked away, quiet and composed, it was clear that this courtroom would not be the last one he stood in, but the next time, he would be the one wearing the robe, not standing before it. Isaiah didn't bask in the attention. He didn't look back at the reporters still yelling his name. He walked with purpose, his mother's hand on his shoulder, both of them moving forward, not in triumph, but in truth. But the story wasn't just his. It was a warning, because if this could happen to Isaiah, a boy with years of quiet preparation and an unshakable mind, what about the thousands who never stood a chance? The ones who never got to speak, who never had a mother trained in the law? This wasn't just one victory. It was a reckoning. It was a mirror held up to a justice system that too often punishes skin before crime, posture before facts, presence before proof. And Isaiah knew what had to come next. He wouldn't stop here. He would keep studying, keep building, and one day he'd return to rooms like that one, not as a defendant, but as a voice for the silenced. And maybe, just maybe, he wouldn't be the only one. So ask yourself this: how many stories like Isaiah's are we missing because we've stopped listening? And what would it take for justice to finally look someone like him in the eye and not blink? Sometimes the quietest voices carry the deepest truths. Isaiah's story reminds us that strength doesn't always look like loud speeches or raised fists. It can live in steady eyes, in patient preparation, in the courage to speak when it's easier to stay silent. Many of us have lived long enough to see how systems can fail, how assumptions can harden into injustice. But we've also seen how one person, armed with clarity and conviction, can open a crack wide enough to let the light in. Isaiah didn't change the world in a courtroom that day, but he reminded it to listen. And perhaps that's the lesson for all of us, no matter our age, to keep listening, to stay curious about the truth beneath the surface, and to believe that quiet dignity still has the power to move mountains. In a world that rushes to judge, there is still great value in slowing down, asking questions, and holding space for the full story. Because when we do, we don't just honor one young man's fight, we honor the possibility of a better, fairer world for those still finding the strength to speak. Isaiah didn't celebrate when the judge dismissed the case. He didn't raise his arms or smile for the cameras. Instead, he walked quietly down the courthouse steps, his mother's hand resting gently on his back, guiding him forward. That moment, soft, steady, without applause, held more power than any headline ever could. It was the power of survival, of truth spoken and heard, of dignity reclaimed without needing to shout. And though the courtroom fell silent, the story did not end there. Because healing doesn't come all at once. It arrives in quiet waves, in the rebuilding of trust, in the remembering of voices lost, and in the choice to keep showing up, even when it's hard. What happened to Isaiah was not just about him. It was about every person misjudged, every truth ignored, and every system that still needs to be challenged. His voice may have cracked the silence, but it's up to all of us to make sure the echo never fades. If this story stayed with you, share it. Subscribe to Echoes of Racism so these voices don't fade into silence. In the meantime, I've chosen 2 stories I think will move you just as much. Take care, and we'll see you soon.